didn't see you there. Yeah, the wife divorced me. Yeah, it happens. Sometimes you just need a drink to cool things off, but now that you're here, we can learn about Teshar. Teshar is a lot like Exodia. Hard to piece together, but once you do, it can't be beat. You're going to need about 4 to 5 pieces. Obviously, your bird waifu, Teshar, in the command zone. You'll need a retriever. Let's use a mirror retriever, for example. Then, you're going to need a sac outlet. Let's assume a thermal navigator. Now, what we want to do is we want to loop this retriever using this sac outlet with Teshar in the field's ability infinitely. And the only way to do that is to stay mana neutral or to go infinite mana. So we're going to need to find an artifact that we can loop infinitely that's going to draw out our deck. And unfortunately, there is no 0 mana draw spell. There's a Lotus Petal. So with a Lotus Petal here, we would be able to go infinite. But the 0 mana Everflowing Chalice isn't going to do us any good. Springleaf Drum also isn't going to do us any good. But with a Lotus Petal, we can build up infinite mana. And from there, we can cast an artifact that draws us cards. And then from there, we can win the game. However, let's assume we don't have Lotus Petal, which is going to be the case for a lot of games. We're going to need a cost reducer. Now that we've reduced our artifact spells by 1, we can proceed to cast our Conjurer's Bauble once our retriever is in the yard. And then from there, we cast the Conjurer's Bauble, bring back the retriever, sacrifice the bauble in the yard, draw the card, sacrifice the retriever, returning the bauble, looping infinitely. Now, let's say we don't have the luxury of only using one artifact. So let's get rid of our retriever. Let's get rid of our sac outlet. Let's say we're stuck with a trusty pack beast and a fanatical devotion. Now, we've hit a rough patch. We have the reducer still, but this isn't a death trigger. This is an ETB trigger, which means we're not going to be able to loop just one artifact. We're going to need a second one. And for that, we can bring in our chromatic sphere. So, we sack the pack beast to the outlet, cast the bauble for 0, bringing back the pack beast, no trigger because there's nothing in our graveyard at this point in time. Sacrifice the bauble to draw, sacrifice the pack beast, cast the chromatic sphere for 0, bringing back the pack beast, ETB on the stack, targeting the bauble, returning it to hand. There's 2 creatures in this deck that will require 2 artifacts for the loop, assuming you have the Inspector or the Lotus Petal, and another 0-cost artifact. That's going to be the Leonin Squire. That will also bring back on ETB, not on death. Now, let's go into another scenario. Let's say we don't have the luxury of having a cost reducer. Well, then we're in a rough patch, aren't we? But let's say we got a mana rock on the field. Then let's say that we have a draw scorpion on the field. So now, whenever another artifact creature dies, we get to untap an artifact. Let's bring back our mirror retriever. Let's bring back our artifact. So, we'll tap our Thought Vessel for 1, sacrificing the retriever, no targets. We go ahead. We get our draw scorpion trigger, untapping target artifact, which is going to be our thought vessel. Tap it again. We have 2 mana floating. Use one of it to cast a Conjurer's Bauble, bringing back the Mirror Retriever, sacking the Bauble, drawing the card, sacking the Retriever. Draw Scorpion trigger. Target the Thought Vessel. We have 1 mana floating. Now we have 2 mana floating. Mirror Retriever trigger. Target the Bauble. This will only work with artifact creatures. It will not work with our Pack Beast or with our Leonin Squire. Let's move on to another scenario. Let's say we have a Golem Foundry. Then let's say we have a 0 mana artifact, like an Everflowing Chalice. Everflowing Chalice, and let's bring back our Mirror Retriever. We can cast this for 0, no trigger. Sacrifice in response for the Teshar trigger. Bring it back. And the only issue with this is we can't use a Fanatical Devotion or an Ashnod's for this combo. We can only use one of our 2 artifact sack outlets. So let's bring back our Thermal Navigator. Sacrificing an artifact. Our Everflowing Chalice. Sacrificing Retriever. Targeting the Everflowing Chalice. Turning it to hand. Casting it again. Getting infinite charge counters on Golem Foundry to make infinite golems. That is not an instantaneous win. However, it does produce those conditions. Let's move to another scenario. Keeping our Thermal Navigator in play, let's bring back a cost reducer, our Starnheim Courser. We sacrifice a Mirror Retriever, no targets. We pay 0 for a Springleaf Drum, getting a Teshar trigger, targeting the Mirror Retriever. Comes back to the field. We untap it. We make 1 mana of any color. We'll choose white. We'll sacrifice the Springleaf Drum, sacrifice the Mirror Retriever, targeting the Springleaf Drum in our yard, returning it to hand. Make infinite mana using this process. The same can be done with a cost reducer and Springleaf Drum. So it can be done with the other one as well. Same can be done with Lotus Petal, is what I meant to say. So a few other things about Teshar that you may have questions about. Obviously, it is not as fast as other combo decks. However, it is excellent against combat decks because it is a creature-centric deck. My current version on Moxfield obviously runs 36 creatures. Most of those creatures are designed to help draw cards, or to help interact with the board in some way, or protect our board. So we see here we have stuff like an Outlaw Medic. We have stuff like Skyscanner. Filigree Familiar, obviously. And then we should also touch on another subject, which is going to be our flash creatures, which is going to be Tooth, a Goblin Firebomb. A Spiked Pit Trap is in the list, but it is not in my physical deck at the moment. And we'll use these 2 as an example. We'll return our previous board state to discuss the flash artifact lines. And we'll bring back our Mirror Retriever. And we will put something in our yard. Let us put in our yard, we won't use that. We will use a Kami as an example. So we are being attacked currently. Our Teshar is on the board. And we have a Kami in the yard, and we have a Retriever and a Thermal Navigator. These two don't need to be here for this, so we're just going to actually remove those. We have a Goblin Firebomb in our hand, which is a flash artifact. We are being attacked for lethal damage. We can flash in our Goblin Firebomb in response to return our Kami, so that we may sacrifice it, negating all combat damage this turn. That's just one example. It also works against exile effects that target at instant speed. So if you are intending to combo off, and you know that someone has a Fairy Macabre in hand, flashing in artifacts or keeping flash artifacts in your hand is an excellent way to accomplish that goal. If you have an untapped creature on board, you are able to use a Tooth of Chiscoria, and you are capable of infinitely casting the Tooth of Chiscoria. Have it right around here. Assuming you have obtained your infinite neutral loop, you may cast a Tooth of Chiscoria, which gives your creature +1 attack until end of turn. And at the end here, it's also a flash artifact. So if you cast that infinitely tap it before sacrificing it, then you are capable of giving one of your creatures infinite attack and swinging for lethal at someone potentially as well. Let's bring back our Retriever, and this time we will use the ideal sack outlet, which was going to be Ashnod's. And then let's bring back our Mirror Retriever. We'll bring back a Workshop Assistant, which is the same effect as a Mirror Retriever for 1 more mana. And in this state, we can do whatever we'd like. Even in a rough spot here, we're making 2 mana every single time. So we can use, let's say we use a Chromatic Star. So we can sacrifice this, no targets, cast a Chromatic Star with 1 mana left floating from the Ashnod's, turning the Workshop Assistant, using one of our colorless floating, sacrificing the Chromatic Star, generating a white mana, and drawing a card from our deck, sacrificing the Workshop Assistant, returning the Chromatic Star, which allows us to infinitely loop. Now, a few key things to note about our interaction in the deck, one of which being a Goblin Firebomb. Firebomb is an expensive spell for its ability to destroy target permanent. It should not be used on anything that is not game-winning. An example would be a Gretchen or a Laylor land. And we also have a Cathar Commando. Once again, this should be reserved for specific effects. I also have teched in a Patrician Scorn and a Holy Light. Most people that play this format do not know what either of these cards are. Patrician Scorn says that when you cast a white spell, you may cast the spell without paying its mana cost. It says destroy all enchantments, which is why there is only 1 enchantment in this deck. The other spell is Holy Light, 3 mana. All non-white creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. This is excellent against gut decks in particular, in response to them casting Inspiring Leader. We obviously have a generous gift in the deck specifically for any kind of combo deck typically. Or you could use it for other reasons, but it's typically reserved for combo. Lauren's Escape protects our commander from being destroyed. Oriok Replica stops the source of our choice from dealing damage, which is excellent. We have a Westfold Rider, which we sacrifice to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. We have a Shelter and a Benevolent Bodyguard, once again protecting our commander. We also run a Prismatic Strands, which is helpful against Izzet decks and Conrad decks. There is a Blacksmith skill in here as well. They may not be in the current list, but these are all options that you are free to use. We have a Dawnbringer Cleric, once again targeting enchantments and exiling cards from graveyards. And also, once we have achieved infinity, our combo outlet is not going to be the majority of these. Obviously, you can infinitely destroy target permanents with Goblin Firebomb, but we're going to be comboing off with a Perilous Mirror, which is going to be when Perilous Mirror is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Obviously, you're going to be targeting the player's face, so you will be casting the Perilous Mirror, returning the Retriever, and sacrificing this endlessly to deal infinite colorless damage to the table. That is going to be your win condition. And do not worry if Perilous Mirror is gone, because we have another flash artifact, which is Springjaw Trap. So we've generated our infinite mana. We sacrifice Springjaw Trap for 4 mana. It deals 3 damage to any target. It enters the graveyard. We return it with the Retriever, thus creating the infinite loop. A fairly simple combo. Stave Off is going to be for dealing with, once again, combo attempts. That is the only thing that we use any of this interaction for, is for combo attempts. If you are using this interaction to do anything other than stop someone from winning, or from preventing you from winning, then you are misusing the interaction. So I will start discussing the lands now as well, because a lot of people have asked me about the lands in this deck and why I run them. Let's go ahead, let's move this out of the way. Move our waifu. And let me see if I can bring up an example here. We have Quicksand, one of our utility lands. We have Darksteel Citadel, Ash Barrens, Conduit Pylons, Radiant Fountain. And I will keep it fairly simple here. We run artifact lands like Ancient Den and Darksteel Citadel for the Scale and Tooth of Discoria, because they have affinity. We run stuff like Quicksand and Desert to deal with decks that, you know, are obviously combat oriented. And if someone attacks with something like a Mana Dork or something, we can just pop it. We don't particularly need a whole lot of white mana pips in this deck, so we can afford to run colorless setups for the most part. I do run Glimmer Post, Radiant Fountain, and Seraph Sanctuary for a life gain. There's nothing wrong with gaining life on a free land. We obviously run Ash Barrens. It helps thin out our deck. We run Conduit Pylons to surveil. Surveilling is good for the most part. It allows us to look at the top card and choose whether or not we want to put it into the graveyard. We run a lot of panorama lands, like Promising Vein, to once again thin out the deck on our opponent's end steps. Without these cards, this deck is a lot weaker, and it is important to make sure you run those panoramas. For a card draw, we do also run a Bonder's Ornament, and for a tutor, we do have a Mirror Kinsmith to tutor out either our Perilous Mirror for whatever reason, or mainly our Mirror Retriever, obviously, which is going to be part of our win condition. We do not particularly care too much about combat phases, since we are typically allowing our creatures that draw us cards to die, so that way we may recur them from the yard. You will also notice that in the deck there is not a lot of sorcery. There is no sorcery speed stuff. That is because when it's time for us to interact, we need to have the available card necessary. If we end up removing something at sorcery speed, it could come back to bite us later on, because if we remove it at sorcery speed, then it's not going to, it may not be what we needed to remove at the time in order to prevent a win attempt. So that is why we do not stop win attempts at sorcery speed. Sorceries for the most part are fairly weak. Unless they help you combo off, then they are unnecessary cards. Or unless they help you tutor. Those are the only two reasons why you should ever have sorcery speed stuff. And then you'll notice we also run about 10 mana rocks, which is useful for the deck. No reason to change it. You don't need more than 10, you don't need less than 10. 10 is the perfect number. We run about 20 cards that draw us cards, which is, once again, an ideal number. You want to keep it pretty high, because once again, the issue with white is that we do not have any tutors. We are lacking those. You'll notice I run stuff like a Militia Bugler and the newest card from MH3, which is Rosecott Knight. That is going to be our two best quote-unquote tutor spells. And obviously, we do run the Thraben Inspectors for the Investigate effects, as well as the Inspiring Overseer and the Arkham's Astrolabe. Mana filtering shouldn't be an issue in this deck. You should never really not have a white pip when you need it, so do not be too worried that half the lands are colorless. And overall, if you are looking to play a deck that requires a lot of heavy thinking and a lot of resource management in order to properly go toe-to-toe with other top meta decks in this format, you are going to have to practice with this more than likely. It is not an easy deck. It is not necessarily a difficult deck either once you understand the combo. But understanding the caveats of how to play the deck is very important. Now, in terms of going against Teshar, Teshar doesn't really care about anything other than two things, which is countering Teshar, which is something we can't interact against as counter spells. And the second thing is going to be exiling cards from our yards at instant speed, which the only method we have of dealing with is going to be instant speed artifacts. And if we are unable to get past the exile effects using our instant speed artifacts, we will not be able to combo off. Those are the only two things that Teshar players care about. And those are the only two real main ways to deal with Teshar comboing off. So if you're playing against him, just focus on those two aspects. If you're playing blue, or if you're playing black, just focus on the yard. Obviously, if you're playing Dimir, you're in a solid position. But other than that, for the most part, you are typically fairly solid as long as they don't get to cast Teshar. If there's any questions, you can leave them in the Moxfield comments on the bottom. Yeah, don't get married. Back to drinking.